It was a Saturday. Kids were playing along the river's edge. Farmers were out early. A few families had set up along the banks the way they always did on weekends. Coolers, folding chairs, the sound of water moving at a pace that felt safe, familiar, almost slow. Nobody had left. Nobody had been told to leave, and then the ground shook. Not an earthquake, not a storm. Just the sound of something enormous giving way. A low, grinding groan that rolled through the valley before most people even understood what they were hearing. Within minutes, a wall of water was moving at speeds no one on foot could outrun. By the time rescuers reached the lower valley, the town looked like something had reached down and just erased it. This is the story of a dam that failed. Not because of a freak accident, not because of something no one could have predicted, but because of decisions made over decades by people who convinced themselves the risk was manageable, that it could wait, that it probably wouldn't happen on their watch. It did. Context and world building, a valley that depended on the water. To understand why this dam mattered, you have to understand the valley it controlled. For most of its history, the region was agricultural. Flat land fed by a river that ran down from higher elevation, seasonal and unpredictable. Dry seasons cracked the soil. Wet seasons flooded crops. The idea of a dam wasn't just appealing, it was the solution to generations of hardship. When construction began in the early 20th century, it was a genuine engineering achievement for its era. Thousands of workers, years of labor, a structure that rose over 100 feet at its tallest point. When the reservoir filled for the first time, people drove from neighboring towns just to see it. The local newspaper called it a triumph of human will over nature. That framing, humans conquering nature, would matter later. Towns grew in the valley downstream, not small clusters of farms, but real towns, with schools and hospitals and whole neighborhoods built on land that had always flooded before the dam existed. The reservoir became the source of drinking water for communities miles away. Irrigation systems spread across the region. An entire economic structure grew up around the assumption that the dam would hold. It was, by every definition, critical infrastructure, not a luxury, not a backup system. The thing everything else depended on. Underlying problem. Built for another era. Here's the part that keeps coming back when you dig into the records. The dam was not built to last forever. Nobody who designed it thought it would be used forever. The engineers who drew up the original plans had a design lifespan in mind. Several decades, after which major renovation or replacement was expected. That lifespan came and went. The dam aged the way old things age when no one wants to pay for maintenance. Gradually and then suddenly. Small cracks in the outer facing. Seepage at the base that showed up in inspection reports going back 30 years before the failure. Sections of the spillway that had been patched and repatched with materials that were, by the time of the collapse, essentially duct tape over a structural wound. The design was also based on hydrology that no longer matched reality. When the dam was built, engineers calculated a probable maximum flood, the worst storm the region could reasonably expect. That number was based on historical rainfall data that stopped in the 1950s. By the 1990s, updated climate data showed the watershed could produce storms significantly larger than what the dam was designed to handle. The spillway, the overflow channel that was supposed to protect the dam in high water events, wasn't big enough. Engineers knew this. It had been flagged in at least 3 separate independent reviews across 2 decades. Nothing was done. Early warning signs, the reports. Nobody acted on this is where the story gets uncomfortable. The warnings weren't hidden. They weren't buried in classified documents or kept from the public out of secrecy. They were in state inspection reports, engineering reviews, and internal communications at the agencies responsible for the dam's oversight. You could file a records request and find them. Some local journalists did. In 1993, state inspectors noted active seepage along the dam's left abutment, the point where the concrete met the valley wall. They recommended monitoring. In 1997, a follow-up inspection found the seepage had increased. They recommended a more detailed study. In 2003, an independent engineering firm hired to assess the dam's condition submitted a report that used the phrase "serious concern" 6 times. They estimated that in a major storm, the spillway could be overwhelmed, leading to erosion and potential overtopping. They recommended immediate spillway upgrades at an estimated cost of roughly $12 million. The governing water authority acknowledged the report, requested a second opinion, and then, when the second opinion reached similar conclusions, quietly moved the project to a capital improvement wish list where it sat unfunded for the next 14 years. Now, what's striking is not that nobody knew. It's that the people who knew convinced themselves it was unlikely enough to be someone else's problem. Budgets were tight. Other projects were competing for funds. The dam had held through big storms before. Probably, they thought, it would again. Rising tension, the storm that changed everything. In late winter of 2017, an atmospheric river, a dense channel of moisture drawn up from the Pacific, stalled over the mountains that fed the reservoir. It rained for 10 days. Not the hard, dramatic rain of a single storm, but the slow, relentless kind that saturates ground and swells rivers inch by inch. By the end of the first week, the reservoir was at 100% capacity for the first time in years. The operators began releasing water through the main spillway to bring the level down. Then the main spillway began to fail. A massive erosion hole opened up in the concrete channel. Engineers watching the spillway cameras could see it growing in real time. They shut down the main spillway and switched to the emergency spillway, a simple earthen weir that had never actually been used in the dam's history. The emergency spillway wasn't designed to handle extended flows. Within hours, water moving over the unlined crest began eating away at the hillside below it. Engineers watching from the bank could see the ground destabilizing. If the erosion reached the concrete weir wall at the top, the whole structure could fail, and nothing would stop a catastrophic release. Evacuation orders went out for 188,000 people downstream. Midpoint re-engagement, a decision made in minutes. What rarely gets talked about is the moment the decision was made. The dam operators had been managing an escalating crisis for nearly 48 hours without sleep. They were making judgment calls with incomplete information, watching systems behave in ways their training hadn't covered, and fielding calls from state officials who wanted updates they couldn't give. At some point in that window, the question shifted from, can we save the spillway, to how do we get people out of the valley alive? That shift, from managing infrastructure to managing survival, is where you see how a system fails at every level simultaneously. The physical structure, yes, but also the funding decisions made 20 years earlier, the inspection reports that recommended action, the capital improvement committee that shelved the upgrades, the assumption, shared across multiple agencies and multiple decades, that catastrophic failure was a theoretical risk, not a scheduled one. It was never just an engineering problem. It was a failure of institutional will. Climax, February 12th, 2017. By the afternoon of February 12th, the erosion below the emergency spillway had eaten away enough hillside that officials believed a catastrophic failure was hours away. The evacuation was the largest in California history. People left with whatever they could grab in minutes. The highways backed up for miles in every direction. Hospital patients were moved. Inmates were transferred out of a nearby correctional facility. Livestock was abandoned. People who had lived in the same houses for 40 years drove away, not knowing if they'd have anything to come back to. The main spillway was put back into operation at full capacity, a controlled release of 100,000 cubic feet per second, to try to lower the reservoir fast enough to take pressure off the emergency spillway. It was a calculated risk. Continuing to destroy the main spillway was better than losing the emergency structure entirely. The dam did not catastrophically fail. The reservoir level dropped. The emergency spillway erosion slowed. But the main spillway was essentially destroyed. Hundreds of millions of dollars of damage. And 188,000 people had spent a terrifying night in their cars on jammed highways, with no clear information about whether they were running from a real collapse or precaution. It was, in the words of one engineer who later testified before the state Senate, a disaster that stopped just short of being a catastrophe. Human impact. The people left. Holding the aftermath. For the communities downstream, the evacuation itself caused harm. An elderly man died of a heart attack in the gridlock evacuation traffic. Dozens of people were injured in accidents on the crowded roads. Livestock losses ran into the hundreds. Mobile home communities, the most economically vulnerable populations in the valley, sustained significant damage when residents left in a hurry without properly securing their homes. For weeks after, people lived in shelters or with relatives, unable to return while engineers assessed whether it was safe. The psychological toll, the uncertainty, the displacement, the return to a changed landscape, fell hardest on people who had the fewest resources to absorb it. One woman who'd lived near the dam for 50 years told a reporter she'd driven past it her whole life without ever once worrying. "We just thought it was solid," she said. "It was just always there." That sentence carries more weight than it might seem. When infrastructure works, it becomes invisible. When it becomes invisible, nobody asks questions. And when nobody asks questions, the people responsible for maintaining it stop feeling pressure to do so. Immediate aftermath. What the water left behind. When people were allowed to return, the main spillway was a wound in the hillside, a gouged canyon of exposed bedrock where engineered concrete had been. The emergency spillway weir was intact, barely. The reservoir had been drawn down to safe levels, but the infrastructure that was supposed to protect it for another century was gone. Reconstruction of the spillway cost $1.1 billion. It took 2 years. State investigations and independent reviews followed. The findings, when they came, were damning in the quietest possible way. Multiple agencies had known about the spillway's inadequacy for decades and had not prioritized repairs. The fundamental design flaws were documented, escalated, and then deprioritized in favor of more immediately visible projects. Nobody faced criminal charges. Several officials retired. The dam was repaired. Broader consequences. What this tells us about infrastructure. The Oroville Dam crisis, because that's what this is, the tallest dam in the United States and California, became a case study in infrastructure management almost immediately. The deeper issue it exposed isn't unique to Oroville. Across the United States, the American Society of Civil Engineers has rated the country's dam infrastructure at a D grade for years. There are more than 90,000 dams in the U.S. Roughly 2,300 of them are classified as high hazard, meaning their failure would likely cause loss of life and in deficient condition. The problem isn't that engineers don't know what needs to be fixed. The problem is that fixing things that haven't failed yet requires spending money on something that doesn't feel urgent until it becomes catastrophic. Elected officials face pressure to fund visible problems. A crumbling spillway doesn't generate headlines until the water starts moving. Modern day relevance, the risk we keep. Deferring this pattern shows up everywhere you look in aging infrastructure. Bridges built in the 1950s and 1960s are now past their design life. Water mains in major cities are over a century old. Levees protecting coastal communities are rated for storms from a different climate era. The problem, in most cases, is not ignorance. It's the same logic that kept the Oroville spillway unfunded. Someone else will deal with it. It probably won't happen before the next budget cycle. The risk is real, but not immediate. The risk is always real. It's the immediacy that we miscalculate. Key takeaways. What this story actually teaches. First, infrastructure doesn't fail the day it breaks. It fails over years, through accumulated small decisions not to act. The collapse is the ending of a long story, not the story itself. Second, the gap between we know this is a problem and we are fixing this problem is where disasters live. Inspection reports are not solutions. Documented risk is not managed risk. Third, the communities most exposed to infrastructure failure are almost never the communities making the decisions about infrastructure funding. That distance matters, because it insulates decision makers from the consequences of delay. Fourth, when a system becomes invisible because it works, that's precisely when it needs the most scrutiny. Closing, what we owe the valley. There's something worth sitting with at the end of a story like this. The dam at Oroville still stands. It was repaired with new concrete, new engineering, new money that came only after the crisis made it impossible to defer anymore. The communities downstream still live there. The reservoir still fills every winter. But the people who drove away in the February dark of 2017 in a miles-long line of headlights moving through an evacuated valley didn't know any of that. They just knew the water was coming, and they had to move. They'd trusted the dam their whole lives, not because someone told them to, but because it had always been there. Solid, enormous, quiet. The kind of thing you stop thinking about because thinking about it means confronting what its failure would mean. We do this with most of what holds our world together. We don't tend to trust things until they've earned it. We tend to trust them until they've lost it. And in infrastructure, by the time that trust is broken, someone is usually already running.